Well, also not only thank you for having me, but also thank you to Laura for sort of giving this broad overview of how important and adaptive reuse is and what potentials it has for urban development. I'm not only sort of geographically changing the focus a bit, but also I'm changing the focus to public open spaces, of course, and also be using the word ecosystem, but in a very different context than in the movie before. And I want to sort of discuss two examples of public spaces and use them as a way to rethink a bit the notion of adaptivity, which I think is important to harness the full potential of adaptive reuse. And of course, as you all know, adaptive reuse commonly refers to the repurposing of existing buildings. So public space is not so much integrated in the discourse yet. But I think that's also very, very necessary. And I guess that everybody in the audience can think of, I don't know, 2 to 5 examples of empty spaces or empty buildings that have high architectural or historical value sitting empty in their hometowns. And everybody wonders, why is that? Yeah. And so it's really important to understand why it's not happening more. So we've seen the great examples that Laura was giving us, but also to understand why it's not happening more, to really harness sort of adaptive reuse as a level for resource reduction. It seems that my mouse is not working. Yes. Okay. And for the Austrian context, within IG Lebenszyklusbau, which is an association that tries to bring a life cycle perspective into the building industry, and we are part of that. We did a stakeholder process with people from the building industry, developers, but also municipal administration to understand the challenges of adaptive reuse. And what it showed, that also talked about sort of good examples, and from that we could learn that the successful cases are successful also because they really understood well the potential of the existing spaces, spatially and socially, on a neighborhood level and also on a city-wide level, and also because they provided flexibility in their solutions, so that the repurposing is actually an ongoing process. It doesn't just happen once, but it can happen again and again and again if sort of architectural adaptation happens in a way that it's not centering on one function only. So, but the actual situation, despite the many good examples, is actually lagging behind. And this slide shows some of the challenges that the stakeholders have identified why adaptive reuse is not more common. And then you can see that only some of that is about the financial aspects, namely sort of the need to have more incentives and support schemes, or to ensure financial viability through updated regulations. But a lot of it is also about legal standards, rules and regulations that hinder adaptation of existing buildings. In the Austrian context, for instance, up to a few days ago, basically, it was you had the same building standards for newly built buildings and for renovated or adapted buildings, which of course is very different. So it was really a focus to bring the legal standards up to date, and also to simplify funding procedures, for instance. So you can see a lot of that is organization. It's not only money, and it's not only finding the right use for the right building, but it's more of a mindset that is that is not open enough for this adaptive reuse, and that is sort of lagging behind the necessity to create an atmosphere where this adaptation is happening. So, and that that review was done with buildings in mind, and I would say, or I would claim, that the challenges that I identified, they're even bigger for the adaptation of public spaces, because simply for the different economical bases that public spaces have. So with that, let me switch to the other examples. Where sort of open spaces feature more prominently, and which raise a different question, namely by which means do we adapt if we're not using the building industry and architecture and mineral materials. This is in Amsterdam. It's a former harbor, also an industrial brownfield, that was turned into a mix of park, public space, cultural hub, temporary residence, and hotels. It was intended as an interim use before being converted into a permanent residential area. And here the main protagonist, or one of the main protagonists, let me phrase it like that, was not sort of outstanding architecture and sort of the building industry itself, or not even only the actors, the human actors, but it was the plants. And why is that? The site was contaminated and had to be cleaned before it could be repurposed. This could have gone sort of the conventional and very costly way of excavating all the contaminated soil. But the city, together with cultural institutions that were already present on the premises and were looking for a space for themselves, instead opted for interim use. So while phytoremediation could take place, and phytoremediation is sort of the use of plants to purify the soil. And what becomes clear through that is that adaptive, or more clear than in any other example, is that adaptive projects should aim at integrating into existing ecosystems and cycles, ideally improving them. This refers to water, waste, energy flows, as well as to the metabolism of soil, planting, and building material, because then they have the opportunity to positively influence the material and energy flows and enable the reactivation of ecosystem services on a larger scale. Sort of the soil again becomes part of a system of absorbing, filtering, storing rainwater. New planting improves air quality, and so on, filters particulate matter, while also reducing heat island effect. Also, leftover material can be reused from the very conception of the project on. Here are some examples of what this looks like. It's this very specific situation where you cannot tread on the soil because it is contaminated. So you have these wooden walkways that guide you through this area. You have the houseboats that were put there because they provided a very mobile residential solution. It was a very active neighborhood, a cultural hub. You can there was also hotels. You could stay there, and you can now. And this sort of final picture shows you how the area is being dismantled because the phytoremediation has taken place. The soil is not contaminated anymore, and it now is being converted in a permanent residential area. And so this, what I want to stress is that this phytoremediation is a very low-tech approach, and it's often neglected. Also, maybe because we assume that technology is simply necessary for creating the solutions that we are looking for. But yeah, to go with the old quote, technology is the answer, but what was the question? Yeah. So I think from that example, we can really learn that the digital technology or any other technology can help cities and neighborhoods transform resource flows, but also traditional neighborhoods and cities can also achieve the same goals by different means and different tools. So it's really, I think, in this current atmosphere of innovation for innovation's sake, we should really reconsider judging cities on their ability to make genuine contributions to the transition towards healthy, safe, and above all livable urban futures, embedded within environmental sustainability, and not so much whether they use technology or not for that. Sorry to go back to this. And I think what the project also teaches us is that if change is already underway, even sort of under negative circumstances, like here the contaminated soil that the city needed to get rid of, it is a window of opportunity if there is a good understanding of the social and spatial potential of the area. So the pressure to act is tangible, stakeholders are already involved, space is available, and the current needs can be addressed directly through experimental means. And this temporary redesign and the associated reallocation of space make it possible to test concepts under real-world conditions, but without committing to major investments. They create open processes that sometimes are more readily accepted by the inhabitants or the surrounding people, because they can still integrate into the process. The final outcome remains still negotiable. And also they produce immediately sort of perceptible improvements. They provide an area that people can perceive immediately, the qualities they can perceive immediately without lengthy planning procedures. So the insights and the evaluation results gained then can be used constructively for the permanent redefinition of that area. And as I said, the area is now a building site again for a residential area, but a lot that has been learned from the past 10 years is integrated into the new concept for the residential areas. A lot of the initiatives are planned into the new neighborhood again. And then, of course, we have other questions that are very, very important, namely, where do we adapt? A space that one might not immediately think of when you think of adaptive reuse is street space, mainly because it lacks what we perceive as historical or architectural value, because it's a everyday space. It's the space still that we use most often, that all of us use, and that can make a very big change towards adaptation to climate change. To date, I would argue that the measures for climate change adaptations have predominantly focused on dense inner city areas and their street spaces. But that focus overlooks another reality, namely that a lot of urban growth is happening on the outskirts of the cities, in peri-urban or suburban areas along the outskirts of the cities, and that these dynamic areas also require integrated planning to ensure high quality of life, reduced resource consumption, and also climate protection strategies. And because the need to also adapt these areas has been neglected so far, institutional capacity might be low, and education or awareness building is really important for the issue. So we always try to publish our research results in guidebooks or toolboxes that are readily available to administrative personnel at the municipalities themselves or local politicians and so on and so forth. So to really bring that information to the people who are responsible for shaping these spaces. And that is a map of one of these small cities in Austria that have a lot of suburban space. And what you can see here highlighted in red is all the spaces, or in red and orange, is all the spaces that face a dual climate hazard, namely a flooding hazard and severe heat island effects. And it's not only that they're facing climate hazard, but it's also that these are the spaces where most people are, that they need to use these people on their way to school, on their way to work, for their daily businesses. Yeah, and what we did was sort of a layered mapping approach to come to see where sort of it's most important to intervene, also as a way to support an economical approach for these cities that don't have such a big finance basis, to see if they're tackling the issue, then they should prioritize addressing these areas. And that also is important to talk about street spaces in peri or suburban areas, because most of the land in that area is owned privately, and you don't have much green space or open space like a square or so that the city could adapt. So it's really, the street space is really sort of the only existing potential for climate change adaptation in these areas. And once you identify specific areas like, I don't know, car parks, fragmented green corridors, unused verges or so, it's really important to consider them in a territorial context, yeah, so that they can realize the full potential in terms of microclimate improvement, rainwater management, quality of life, and habitat enhancement. Because then you can develop a green space strategy, and that also is from that research project Perisponge, where we developed green space strategies for the cities in our project, because they can help identify landscape connections that should be strengthened, and also point out where adaptation projects can play a supportive role in that regard. And even though I've been talking about sort of ecosystems and climate change adaptation a lot now, I think it's really important to understand that the adaptation of street space is also important in terms of climate justice, because these are the spaces that people use on a daily basis, and especially those who are not so well off, who are elderly, who are too young to have other means of transport than public transport or walking or so on. They really depend on these spaces, and so their quality has a direct impact on how they how well they are protected from the changing climate. So the adaptation of street space is a major concern in our education and research, and also in our sort of awareness raising activity. And that's also one of the reasons why we've published a book. It's called Courage, it's just coming out in a few weeks, and it's featuring transformation and adaptation projects across Europe. These 12 examples are featured, and I want to show one example in more detail. It's a small town in the west of Austria, in Vorarlberg. It's called Göfis, and until quite recently had a village center like many others that you know. It was basically a parking space and not much more. But to turn around the situation, the municipality acquired some vacant lots or empty houses in the city center or in the village center, and build social infrastructure there, like the library that you can see on the left hand pictures with the two kids running in front. And that was the start to transform the city center into more a space that provided more beauty, to speak in Bauhaus terms, invited more active mobility, is more adapted to climate change, and fulfills better the role of this active village center. As part of the research that we did on all these transformation examples, we also looked at the distribution of space, and you can see how it changed from this large percentage of space that is for passive mobility, the car parking space, asphalt, sealed soils, and very little space for green or active mobility, and how it's developed now. You can see that this distribution of space towards livability and ecosystem improvement has really grown impressively. And what you can see, yeah.
Because we're running a bit late.
I have 2 more slides or 3. Yeah. And what you can also see is how this is not a singular space, but that it branches out into the village and connects to important pathways. Yeah. And that was possible because it was a very integrated planning approach that integrated regional planning, federal planning, the municipal planning, but also very important participatory processes that guaranteed not only sort of a great outcome, but constant support throughout the whole process. So coming back to one of the most important questions is, how do we adapt, and how do we sort of have that as a mindset? It's really important to understand that adaptive reuse concerns everyday outdoor spaces just as much as historical buildings, and equally links to building culture, and that adaptivity needs to be a mindset that accompanies urban transformation. It's sort of the underlying quality of any urban process. And I want to end with a quote that Philippe Watteo in our book gives when he talks about transforming spaces, and he says whether obstacles merely delay progress, force adjustment, or torpedo a project depends on the political will and the courage of the policymaker. And I think with that we've come full circle back to the policy analysis that I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation, of the policy environment that supports adaptive reuse. Thank you.